Hey guys, tonight we begin with the savage, unforgiving, and absolutely horrific world of real pirates. Those romanticized figures swinging from ship to ship with cutlasses gleaming in the moonlight. While Hollywood makes them look like dashing rogues living lives of adventure and freedom. The truth is, being a pirate was one of the most brutal, degrading, and short-lived existences you could possibly endure. Your body would be ravaged by disease. Your mind would be broken by violence, and society would hunt you like a rabid animal until your inevitable and gruesome end. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You didn't choose to become a pirate. Pirates weren't born from dreams of adventure or romantic notions of freedom on the high seas. They were created by desperation, violence, and the complete collapse of any other option for survival. Most pirates began their careers as pressed men, sailors kidnapped from taverns, snatched from the streets, or simply grabbed from other ships and forced into service aboard vessels they never wanted to see. The press gangs that roamed the ports of the Caribbean and Atlantic coast were brutal and efficient. They'd sweep through waterfront districts like human nets, collecting anyone who looked capable of hauling rope or climbing rigging. Age didn't matter much. Boys as young as 12 and men as old as 50 could find themselves dragged aboard a ship. Their old lives severed as cleanly as a cutlass stroke. You might have been a farmer visiting port to sell grain, a carpenter looking for work, or simply a drunk stumbling home from a tavern. None of that mattered once the press gang spotted you. The transition from unwilling sailor to pirate wasn't a dramatic transformation with ceremonies and oaths. It was a gradual erosion of humanity that began the moment you were shoved below deck on your first ship. The conditions aboard merchant vessels and naval ships were so appalling that piracy often seemed like an improvement rather than a descent into criminality. At least pirates shared their plunder equally, while legitimate sailors were cheated, beaten, and worked to death for wages they might never see. Your first taste of life at sea was a baptism in misery. The ship's hold where you'd sleep was a fetid cave of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste. The air was so thick with stench that breathing became a conscious effort. Men would vomit from seasickness, dysentery, and sheer revulsion, adding to the toxic soup that sloshed around your feet with every roll of the ship. Privacy was non-existent. You'd eat, sleep, and relieve yourself in full view of dozens of other men, all of whom were as desperate and dangerous as you were becoming. The work was backbreaking and never-ending. 18-hour days were common, spent hauling heavy ropes, climbing treacherous rigging, and performing maintenance tasks that could kill you if you made the slightest mistake. Your hands would blister and bleed within days, then callous into permanent claws. Your back would ache from the constant bending and lifting. Your feet would be cut and bruised from the rough deck planking. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and brief, just enough to keep you functional for the next day's torment. The food was barely edible and often crawling with maggots. Hardtack biscuits were so infested with weevils that sailors would tap them against the table to shake out the bugs before eating. The meat was salted to the point of being nearly inedible, and the water was green with algae and tasted of the wooden barrels where it had been stored for months. Scurvy was inevitable. Your gums would bleed, your teeth would loosen, and your body would slowly begin to consume itself from the inside out. The officers treated you like livestock, valuable enough to keep alive, but disposable enough to beat senseless for the slightest infraction. The cottontails was a constant threat. Its knotted leather strips capable of flaying the skin from a man's back in a dozen strokes. You'd watch fellow sailors flogged until they passed out from pain, then revived with salt water thrown on their wounds. The screaming would echo through the ship for hours afterward, a reminder to everyone of what happened to those who stepped out of line. Disease was your constant companion. Typhus, yellow fever, and dysentery swept through ships like wildfire. killing men faster than battles ever could. You'd wake up to find the man sleeping next to you cold and stiff, his body already beginning to bloat in the tropical heat. The dead were sewn into canvas shrouds and thrown overboard with minimal ceremony. There was no time for proper mourning when survival demanded constant vigilance. The violence wasn't limited to official punishments. Desperate men in desperate circumstances turn on each other with frightening regularity. Fights would break out over scraps of food, accusations of theft, or simply the maddening stress of being trapped together in hellish conditions. You'd learn to sleep with one eye open and your knife within easy reach because the man who smiled at you during the day might try to cut your throat at night for your meager possessions. Your first encounter with actual pirates might come during a raid on your own ship. The black flag would appear on the horizon and terror would grip the crew like a physical force. But as the pirates swarmed aboard, cutlasses flashing and pistols smoking, you might notice something unexpected. They moved with purpose and discipline. Not the chaotic bloodlust you'd been told to expect. They were professionals, and they offered you something your current masters never had: a choice. The pirate captain would address the captured crew with surprising civility, explaining that any man who wished to join their company would be welcomed as an equal brother. Those who preferred to remain with their current ship would be allowed to go free, though they might be stripped of weapons and supplies. It was a stark contrast to the press gangs that had originally enslaved you. Here was voluntary service, democratic decision-making, and the promise of fair shares in any plunder taken. The decision to go on the account, as joining a pirate crew was called, wasn't made lightly. You knew you were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Once you took the pirate oath and signed the articles, you became an enemy of all civilized nations. There would be no going home, no return to your old life, no mercy if you were captured. But looking around at your current circumstances, the brutal officers, the starvation rations, the constant threat of disease and violence, piracy began to look less like damnation and more like liberation. Your transformation from pressed sailor to pirate wasn't marked by any dramatic ceremony. You simply stepped across from one ship to another, leaving behind whatever remained of your former identity: the clothes on your back, the calluses on your hands, and the scars on your body came with you. But everything else, your name, your past, your connections to the civilized world, was left floating in the wake of your old ship. The pirate crew welcomed you with rough camaraderie, but also with watchful suspicion. You were still an unknown quantity, a potential spy or coward who might betray them at the first sign of trouble. You'd have to prove yourself through action, demonstrating your loyalty and courage in the crucible of combat and hardship. The brotherhood of pirates wasn't given freely. It had to be earned through blood, sweat, and shared suffering. Your new shipmates were a collection of the desperate, the violent, and the dispossessed. Former sailors like yourself escaped slaves seeking freedom, debtors fleeing their creditors, soldiers deserting from brutal armies, and criminals of every description. What united them wasn't noble purpose or shared ideals, but mutual dependence and the knowledge that they were all outcasts from the world they'd left behind. The ship itself was your new home, prison, and fortress all-in-one. Unlike the merchant vessels or naval ships you might have known, a pirate ship was organized around the principle of survival through violence. Every modification, every piece of equipment, every aspect of daily life was designed to make the ship more effective at hunting, capturing, and plundering other vessels. You were no longer just a sailor. You were a predator, and the vast ocean was your hunting ground. Your education in piracy began immediately. You'd learn to handle cutlass and pistol, to move silently through rigging, to read the signs that indicated a potential prize on the horizon. But more importantly, you'd learn to think like a pirate, to see every ship as potential plunder, every port as a source of supplies and information, every encounter as an opportunity for profit or a threat to be eliminated. The psychological transformation was perhaps the most profound change you'd undergo. The moral constraints that had governed your previous life, respect for property, obedience to authority, concern for innocent life, would gradually erode under the constant pressure of survival. You'd learn to justify violence as necessity, theft as fair redistribution, and murder as self-defense. The line between right and wrong would blur until it disappeared entirely, replaced by the simpler calculus of survival and profit. Your old identity would fade like a half-remembered dream. The person you'd been before with family, friends, hopes, and dreams would seem like someone else entirely. In their place would emerge a harder, more ruthless individual shaped by the demands of pirate life. You'd adopt a new name, new mannerisms, new loyalties. The transformation would be so complete that even you might struggle to remember who you'd been before the black flag claimed you. Your new home was a wooden prison that reeked of death, disease, and human misery. The pirate ship that had seemed like salvation compared to your previous vessel quickly revealed itself to be another form of hell, just with different tormentors and slightly better food. The romantic image of pirates sailing free across endless blue waters was a cruel joke. You were trapped in a cramped, stinking, dangerous environment with some of the most violent and unstable men alive. The ship itself was a maze of hazards designed to kill the unwary. Every surface was slick with salt spray, tar, and various bodily fluids. The deck planking was worn smooth by countless feet, and could send you sliding into the rail or overboard with one careless step. The rigging above was a spider's web of ropes, some strong enough to support a man's weight, others rotted through and ready to snap at the worst possible moment. You'd learn to test every handhold, every foothold, because a single mistake could send you plummeting to the deck or into the shark-infested waters below. Below deck was where the real horror lived. The gun deck, where the cannons were housed, was a low-ceiling cavern that forced even average-sized men to walk hunched over. When the guns were run out for battle, there was barely room to move between them. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of gunpowder, rotting wood, billigege water, and the accumulated stench of men who hadn't bathed in months. The air was so thick you could almost chew it, and breathing became a conscious effort that left you gasping for clean air that never came. Your sleeping quarters were a hammock slung between two cannons, if you were lucky enough to have one. More often, you'd sleep on the deck itself, using a coil of rope as a pillow and your coat as a blanket. Privacy was non-existent. You'd sleep shoulder to shoulder with men who might try to rob or kill you in your sleep. The constant motion of the ship meant that sleep was fitful at best, and you'd wake up bruised from rolling into your neighbors or the ship's fittings. The food was marginally better than what you'd endured on legitimate ships, but that wasn't saying much. The ship's cook, usually a man who'd lost a limb in battle and could no longer perform regular duties, would prepare meals in a galley that was little more than a firebox surrounded by barrels of supplies. The staples were salt pork so hard you could use it as a weapon, hard-tack biscuits that had to be soaked in rum to be edible, and a thin GRL made from whatever vegetables hadn't rotted completely. Water was a constant concern. The barrels that held your drinking supply were breeding grounds for algae, bacteria, and various forms of marine life. The water would turn green within weeks of leaving port, and by the end of a long voyage, it would be thick enough to chew. Most pirates preferred rum or beer, not for the alcohol content, but because the fermentation process killed some of the harmful organisms that made water so dangerous to drink. The rats were your constant companions. And in many ways, they lived better than you did. They had the run of the ship, access to all the food stores, and the ability to escape to hidden spaces when danger threatened. You'd wake up to find them gnawing on your clothes, your food, or occasionally your flesh if you slept too soundly. Some pirates actually welcomed the rats. They were a source of fresh meat when supplies ran low, and their behavior could warn of storms or other dangers. Disease was the invisible enemy that killed more pirates than all the naval battles combined. Scurvy would rot your gums and loosen your teeth until eating became agony. Dysentery would leave you weak and dehydrated, fouling yourself constantly as your body expelled everything you tried to consume. Typhus would burn through your body like fire, leaving you delirious and covered in the distinctive rash that marked you for death. Yellow fever would turn your skin the color of old parchment and fill your vomit with blood. The ship's surgeon, if there was one, was usually a butcher who'd learned his trade on the battlefield rather than in any medical school. His primary tools were a bone saw, a bottle of rum for anesthesia, and a red-hot iron for cauterizing wounds. Surgery was performed on the gun deck by lantern light with the patient held down by his shipmates while the surgeon worked. The screaming could be heard throughout the ship, and the mortality rate was so high that many men preferred to take their chances with untreated wounds rather than submit to the surgeon's ministrations. The smell of the ship was something that would haunt you for the rest of your life. It was a complex bouquet of human waste, rotting food, stagnant water, gunpowder, tar, and death. The smell would permeate your clothes, your hair, your skin, until you couldn't escape it even in your dreams. Other pirates could identify you by scent alone, and civilized people would recoil from you before you even spoke. Bathing was a luxury that most pirates couldn't afford. Fresh water was too precious to waste on washing, and salt water would leave your skin raw and infected. Most men simply accepted their filth as part of the pirate condition, though some would strip naked during rainstorms to let the fresh water wash away the worst of the accumulated grime. Lice and fleas were universal companions, and you'd spend idle moments picking parasites from your clothes and hair. The ship's structure was constantly deteriorating under the assault of saltwater, storms, and combat damage. Planks would work loose, allowing water to seep into the hold. The rigging would fray and snap, requiring constant repair and replacement. The sails would develop tears that had to be patched with whatever material was available. Every pirate was expected to be a carpenter, sailmaker, and rope splicer because the ship's survival depended on everyone's ability to maintain and repair the vessel. The BGE, the lowest part of the ship where water collected, was a toxic soup of ciata, urine, vomit, and decomposing organic matter. The smell that rose from the BGE was so foul that it could knock a man unconscious. And the water itself was poisonous to touch. Yet someone had to go down into that hellish space regularly to operate the pumps that kept the ship from sinking. It was usually the newest or least popular crew members who drew this duty. And many emerged from the BGE sick with infections that would plague them for months. The constant motion of the ship was maddening for those not accustomed to it. The deck would pitch and roll unpredictably, sending men and objects sliding across the planking. Eating, sleeping, and even standing still became challenges that required constant attention and adjustment. Seasickness was common even among experienced sailors, and the combination of nausea, dehydration, and the ship's foul air could leave men prostrate for days. Fire was perhaps the greatest fear aboard any wooden ship, but especially a pirate vessel loaded with gunpowder and rum. A single spark in the wrong place could turn the entire ship into an inferno within minutes. The galley fire was carefully tended and surrounded by sand and water barrels. But accidents were common. Many pirates bore burned scars from cooking fires, cannon blasts, or the flaming debris of enemy ships. The smell of burned flesh was another component of the ship's distinctive aroma. The ship's armament was both your protection and your greatest danger. The cannons were massive iron beasts that could crush a man if they broke loose from their restraints during a storm. The gunpowder was stored in the ship's magazine, a powder keg that could explode at any moment if mishandled. The small arms, cutlasses, pistols, and muskets were kept sharp and loaded, ready for instant use, but also ready to cause accidental injury to the careless or unlucky. Your personal space consisted of whatever you could carry in a sea chest or bag. Everything you owned had to fit in a container small enough to be moved quickly if the ship was damaged or captured. Most pirates owned little more than a change of clothes, a weapon or two, and perhaps a few personal mementos from their previous life. Theft was common, and anything left unguarded would quickly disappear into someone else's possession. The ship's hierarchy was enforced through violence and the constant threat of violence. The captain's word was law. backed up by loyal crew members who would kill anyone who challenged his authority. The quartermaster controlled the distribution of food, water, and plunder, making him the second most powerful man aboard. Below them were the various specialists: the navigator, the gunner, the carpenter, each with their own area of expertise and responsibility. At the bottom were the common sailors, men like yourself, who did the dangerous, dirty work that kept the ship functioning. The psychological pressure of living in such conditions was enormous. Men would crack under the strain, becoming violent, paranoid, or simply catatonic. Suicide was not uncommon. Pirates would throw themselves overboard rather than endure another day of the floating hell they'd chosen as their home. Others would go mad, talking to imaginary companions or believing they were still living in their previous lives. The ship was a pressure cooker of human misery, and everyone aboard was slowly being cooked alive by the experience. Yet this floating hell was your world now, and you'd have to learn to not just survive in it, but to thrive. The ship that seemed like a prison was also your weapon, your fortress, and your only hope of survival in a world that wanted you dead. You'd have to make peace with the rats, the stench, the disease, and the constant threat of death, because this wooden hell was the only home you had left. The pirate crew wasn't a family or a band of brothers, despite what romantic tales might suggest. It was a collection of desperate, violent men held together by mutual need, shared danger, and the knowledge that betrayal meant death. The bonds between pirates were forged in blood and maintained through fear. And the democracy they practiced was more like organized anarchy than any civilized form of government. The pirate articles that governed your new life were written in blood and enforced with steel. These weren't noble documents proclaiming rights and freedoms. They were survival manuals that spelled out exactly how a group of murderers and thieves could work together without killing each other. Every crew had their own version, but the basic principles were universal: equal shares of plunder, democratic decision-making for major choices, and swift, brutal punishment for anyone who broke the rules. Your captain wasn't a king or dictator, but rather a war chief elected by the crew and subject to removal at any time. His authority was absolute during battle when quick decisions could mean the difference between victory and death. But in peacetime he was just another voice in the democratic process, albeit one backed by proven skill and the loyalty of key crew members. Many captains were deposed by their own men, sometimes violently when they failed to deliver the plunder and success the crew demanded. The quartermaster was often more powerful than the captain in day-to-day operations. He controlled the distribution of food, water, and captured goods, making him the arbiter of fairness, and the target of every grievance. A good quartermaster could keep a crew together through the worst hardships, while a corrupt or incompetent one could spark a mutiny that would leave half the crew dead. The position required not just administrative skill, but the physical courage to enforce unpopular decisions and the political acumen to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that existed on every pirate ship. The crew itself was divided into various factions and cliques based on nationality, experience, and personal loyalty. English pirates might band together against French ones, while veterans would look down on newcomers as potential liabilities. These divisions could be exploited by clever leaders or could tear a crew apart if they weren't carefully managed. You'd have to navigate these social currents carefully, building alliances while avoiding enemies, because your survival might depend on having the right friends when trouble arose. Violence was the ultimate arbiter of disputes among pirates. While the articles provided for democratic decision-making, disagreements were often settled through duels, brawls, or simple assassination. A man who felt wronged by another crew member might challenge him to single combat, with the winner taking whatever was in dispute. These fights were brutal affairs, often fought with cutlasses or pistols, and they usually ended in death or permanent disability for one of the participants. The sharing of plunder was supposed to be fair and democratic, but in practice it was a source of constant tension and conflict. The articles might specify that each crew member received an equal share. but there were always disputes about what constituted a fair division. Valuable items like jewelry or fine weapons might be claimed by individuals before the general distribution, leading to accusations of theft and demands for satisfaction. The process of dividing captured goods could take days and often resulted in violence as men fought over their perceived fair share. Trust was a rare and precious commodity among pirates. Every man knew that his shipmates were criminals and killers who had betrayed their previous loyalties to join the crew. The knowledge that everyone aboard was capable of murder and treachery created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and paranoia. You'd learn to sleep with one eye open, to never turn your back on a potential enemy, and to always be ready for the knife that might come from any direction. The code of honor that supposedly governed pirate behavior was more myth than reality. While pirates might show mercy to those who surrendered without a fight, they were just as likely to torture and kill prisoners for sport or information. The romantic notion of honorable thieves who only stole from the rich was laughable. Pirates would rob anyone they could overpower, from wealthy merchants to poor fishermen. The only honor among thieves was the temporary alliance necessary for mutual survival. Loyalty among pirates was conditional and temporary. A man might be your trusted companion one day and your deadly enemy the next, depending on how circumstances changed. Crews would split apart over disagreements about targets, tactics, or the division of plunder. Former shipmates would hunt each other across the Caribbean, seeking revenge for real or imagined slights. The bonds of pirate brotherhood were strong enough to face external enemies, but fragile enough to shatter under internal pressure. The initiation of new crew members was often a brutal affair designed to test their commitment and break down their previous loyalties. You might be forced to participate in acts of violence against innocent victims to prove that you had truly abandoned your former moral constraints. The crew would watch your reactions carefully, looking for signs of weakness or reluctance that might indicate you were still clinging to civilized values. Those who failed these tests might find themselves marooned on a deserted island or simply thrown overboard. The ship's discipline was maintained through a combination of democratic participation and authoritarian enforcement. While major decisions were made by vote, day-to-day operations were controlled by the officers who had the authority to punish infractions with flogging, confinement, or reduction of rations. The punishments were often severe and always public, designed to serve as examples to the rest of the crew. A man who stole from his shipmates might lose a hand, while one who showed cowardice in battle might be marooned or executed. The social hierarchy aboard a pirate ship was fluid but real. Experienced fighters and skilled sailors commanded more respect than newcomers or those with specialized but non-combat skills. A man's reputation for courage, cunning, and success in battle would determine his standing in the crew and his influence in decision-making. Those at the bottom of the hierarchy, the cowards, the incompetent, and the unlucky, were treated as expendable, and might be sacrificed without hesitation if circumstances required it. The crew's relationship with their ship was almost mystical. The vessel wasn't just transportation or a weapon. It was their home, their fortress, and their means of survival. Every man knew the ship's capabilities and limitations intimately, and they would fight to the death to defend it. The loss of their ship meant death or capture for the entire crew. So maintaining and protecting the vessel was everyone's responsibility. This shared dependence created one of the few genuine bonds among the crew members. Women were generally forbidden aboard pirate ships, not out of chivalry, but because their presence was seen as a source of conflict and distraction. The few women who did join pirate crews, like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, had to prove themselves through exceptional courage and skill. They were often more violent and ruthless than their male counterparts, perhaps because they had to overcome additional prejudice and suspicion. The presence of women could disrupt the careful balance of power and loyalty that kept a crew together. The crew's relationship with the outside world was one of mutual hostility. Pirates were enemies of all civilized nations, hunted by naval forces and colonial authorities wherever they went. This shared status as outlaws created a bond among crew members. But it also meant that they could never truly trust anyone outside their immediate circle. Every encounter with strangers was potentially deadly, and paranoia was a survival trait rather than a character flaw. The democratic ideals that pirates claimed to practice were often subverted by the realities of life at sea. While every man might have a vote in theory, in practice, the most violent and charismatic individuals dominated decision-making. The crew might vote to attack a particular target, but the actual tactics would be determined by those with the most combat experience. Democracy among pirates was more like mob rule than any civilized form of government. The Brotherhood of Pirates was ultimately a temporary alliance of convenience rather than a genuine fraternal bond. Men joined pirate crews for personal gain and survival, not out of loyalty to their shipmates or belief in pirate ideals. When circumstances changed, when plunder became scarce, when naval pressure increased, or when better opportunities arose, the Brotherhood would dissolve as quickly as it had formed. The bonds that seemed so strong in battle would prove fragile when tested by adversity or temptation. Your place in this brotherhood was earned through violence and maintained through constant vigilance. You'd have to prove your worth in combat, demonstrate your loyalty through shared hardship, and show your commitment by participating in the crew's crimes. The Brotherhood would protect you as long as you were useful, but it would abandon or destroy you the moment you became a liability. It was a harsh form of fellowship, but it was the only family you had left in a world that wanted you dead. The moment you spotted a potential prize on the horizon, the entire ship would transform from a floating slum into a predatory machine. The lazy routine of daily maintenance and idle conversation would explode into frenzied activity as every man prepared for the deadly game of hunter and prey. This was what you lived for. The chance to take by force what others had earned through honest labor. To prove your courage in combat. And to claim your share of whatever wealth could be stripped from your victims. The first sighting would come from the lookout posted high in the crow's nest. A man with sharp eyes and the lung power to shout his discoveries over the wind and waves. Sail-ho would ring across the deck, followed by details about the stranger's size, heading, and apparent nationality. The crew would drop whatever they were doing and strain their eyes toward the horizon, trying to catch a glimpse of what might be their next victim or their next threat. The captain and his officers would study the distant vessel through their spy glasses, trying to determine whether it was worth pursuing. A heavily armed warship would be avoided unless the crew was feeling particularly suicidal, while a lone merchant vessel would be stalked like a wounded deer. The decision to give chase wasn't taken lightly. It would commit the crew to hours or days of pursuit with no guarantee of success and the constant risk that their quarry might turn out to be more dangerous than it appeared. Once the decision was made to pursue, the ship would come alive with purposeful activity. The sails would be adjusted to catch every breath of wind. The hull would be cleared of unnecessary weight, and the crew would begin the long process of preparing for battle. Weapons would be sharpened and loaded. Boarding equipment would be readied, and the ship's surgeon would set up his crude operating theater in anticipation of the wounded, who would soon need his services. The chase itself was a test of seamanship, endurance, and nerve. Your ship had to be faster than your prey, but speed alone wasn't enough. You had to outmaneuver them, anticipate their course changes, and gradually close the distance without alerting them to your hostile intentions. A good pirate ship could maintain the illusion of being a harmless merchant vessel until the last possible moment when the black flag would be raised and the true nature of the encounter would be revealed. The crew's mood during a chase was a mixture of excitement, fear, and bloodthirsty anticipation. Men would joke and boast about what they did to their victims. But underneath the bravado was the knowledge that they might be sailing toward their own deaths. Every chase was a gamble. The potential reward of captured treasure weighed against the very real possibility of being killed, wounded, or captured by their intended prey. As the distance closed, the tension would become almost unbearable. The crew would watch their quarry for signs of recognition or alarm. A sudden change of course. the appearance of additional sails, or the ominous sight of gunports opening along the stranger's hull. A merchant ship that suddenly revealed itself to be a disguised warship could turn hunters into hunted in a matter of minutes. And many pirate crews had learned this lesson too late to save themselves. The final approach required perfect timing and coordination. The pirate ship would close to within hailing distance, still flying false colors and maintaining the pretense of peaceful intentions. The captain would call out friendly greetings while his crew prepared for violence, their weapons hidden but ready. The moment of truth would come when the black flag was raised and the demand for surrender was shouted across the water. The response of the intended victim would determine what happened next. A wise merchant captain might surrender immediately, knowing that resistance would only make his fate worse. But some would choose to fight, either from courage, desperation, or simple miscalculation of their chances. The pirate crew would watch their quarry's reaction with predatory intensity, ready to respond to either submission or defiance, with overwhelming violence. If the victim chose to resist, the real hunt would begin. Cannon fire would thunder across the water as both ships maneuvered for advantage. The pirates would try to disable their prey's rigging or steering, making escape impossible while keeping the valuable cargo intact. The defenders would fight for their lives, knowing that surrender might mean death anyway, and that their only hope lay in driving off their attackers or reaching the safety of a friendly port. The crew's behavior during the chase revealed the true nature of pirate character. Some men would become almost feral with excitement, their eyes gleaming with the prospect of violence and plunder. Others would grow quiet and focused, checking their weapons and mentally preparing for the brutal work ahead. A few might show signs of fear or reluctance, earning the contempt of their more bloodthirsty shipmates, and marking themselves as potential cowards who couldn't be trusted in a fight. The ship itself would be transformed during the chase, with every available space cleared for action. The deck would be sanded to provide better footing and to absorb the blood that would soon be spilled. Boarding nets would be rigged to prevent enemy sailors from climbing aboard, while grappling hooks and boarding planks would be prepared for the pirates' own assault. The ship would become a weapon, every fitting and fixture designed to facilitate the capture and plunder of other vessels. The psychological warfare that accompanied the physical chase was just as important as seamanship and firepower. Pirates cultivated reputations for extreme violence and cruelty, knowing that fear could be more effective than cannonballs in forcing a surrender. Stories of torture, murder, and atrocity would spread through the maritime community, making the sight of a pirate flag a source of terror that could paralyze resistance before it began. The crew's unity during a chase was both their greatest strength and their greatest vulnerability. When focused on a common enemy, the pirates could work together with deadly efficiency, their individual skills combining into a formidable fighting force. But the same men who cooperated perfectly during the hunt might turn on each other once the immediate danger was past, fighting over the division of plunder or nursing grudges that had developed during the heat of battle. The hunt was also a test of leadership, as the captain and his officers had to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between success and disaster. A captain who showed hesitation or poor judgment during a chase might find his authority challenged by ambitious subordinates who thought they could do better. The crew's confidence in their leaders was directly tied to their success in capturing prizes. And a string of failures could lead to mutiny, and the violent replacement of the ship's command structure. The environmental factors that affected the chase, wind, weather, currents, and visibility, were beyond anyone's control, but could determine the outcome of the encounter. A sudden squall might allow a merchant ship to escape, while a dead calm might trap both hunter and prey in a deadly standoff. Pirates had to be expert seamen as well as fighters, able to read the signs of changing weather and use natural conditions to their advantage. The moment when the black flag was finally raised was the point of no return for both pirates and their victims. It was a declaration of war, a promise of violence, and a commitment to see the encounter through to its bloody conclusion. There could be no retreat, no negotiation, no mercy. Only the brutal arithmetic of predator and prey that would determine who lived, who died, and who would sail away with the spoils of victory. When the moment for violence finally arrived, all the romantic notions about swashbuckling adventure would evaporate in the smoke and screaming chaos of real combat. Battle at sea wasn't a graceful dance of skilled swordsmen. It was a brutal, terrifying melee where men died in agony, and the survivors were often maimed for life. The taste of gunpowder, blood, and fear would fill your mouth as you fought for your life against enemies who were just as desperate and vicious as you had become. The first exchange of cannon fire would shatter the morning air with thunder that could be heard for miles. The massive iron balls would crash into wooden hulls with devastating effect, sending splinters flying like deadly arrows and turning proud ships into floating wreckage in a matter of minutes. The sound was indescribable. A combination of explosion, splintering wood, and human screaming that would ring in your ears long after the battle was over. Your ship would shudder and groan under the impact of enemy fire. The deck planking, buckling, and splitting as cannonballs tore through the hull. Men would be cut down by flying debris, their bodies broken, and bleeding as they writhed in agony among the wreckage of their floating home. The lucky ones would die quickly, while others would linger in torment, calling for help that might never come. As the battle raged around them, the smoke from the cannons would create a fog of war that made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. You'd fight blind, swinging your cutlass at shadows and shapes that might be enemies or might be your own shipmates. The acrid smell of gunpowder would burn your nostrils and throat, while the taste of sulfur would coat your tongue like the breath of hell itself. As the ships closed for boarding, the real carnage would begin. Grappling hooks would fly through the air, their iron claws biting deep into enemy rigging and hull planking. The two vessels would be drawn together like lovers in a deadly embrace, their sides grinding against each other as men prepared to leap across the narrow gap between life and death. The moment when the ships touched was the signal for the most savage fighting you'd ever witness. The boarding party would swarm across the gap with cutlasses flashing and pistols blazing, their faces twisted into masks of rage and bloodlust. These weren't the clean, precise sword fights of romantic fiction. They were desperate brawls where men hacked and stabbed at each other with whatever weapons came to hand. Cutlasses would clash against boarding axes, pistol butts would crush skulls, and men would bite and claw at each other like wild animals. Your first taste of close combat would be a revelation of your own capacity for violence. The civilized restraints that had governed your previous life would fall away like discarded clothing as you fought for survival. You'd discover muscles you didn't know you had, reflexes that seemed to come from some primitive part of your brain, and a willingness to inflict pain and death that would have horrified your former self. The deck would become slippery with blood, making footing treacherous and turning every step into a potential fall that could leave you vulnerable to an enemy's blade. Men would slip and slide in the gore of their fallen comrades, their boots unable to find purchase on the crimson-stained planking. The smell of blood would mix with gunpowder smoke and human waste as men lost control of their bodily functions in the extremity of terror and pain. The sounds of battle would assault your ears from every direction. The clash of steel on steel, the crack of pistol shots, the screams of the wounded and dying, and the guttural roars of men lost in the fury of combat. Some men would fight in silence, their faces grim with concentration, while others would howl like demons as they carved their way through enemy ranks. The cacophony would be so intense that you'd have to rely on hand signals and gestures to communicate with your shipmates. The wounded would crawl across the deck seeking shelter or aid, leaving trails of blood in their wake. Some would beg for mercy, while others would try to drag themselves to safety or continue fighting even with mortal wounds. You'd learn to step over or around the fallen without breaking stride, because stopping to help a wounded man might mean joining him in death. Compassion was a luxury that few could afford in the heat of battle. The ship's surgeon would work frantically in his makeshift operating theater, sawing off shattered limbs and trying to stop arterial bleeding with whatever tools and supplies he had available. The screams from the surgery area would add another layer of horror to the battle's soundtrack. As men realized that survival might mean living the rest of their lives as cripples. Many would prefer death to the prospect of begging for scraps in some waterfront tavern. Their fighting days ended by a surgeon's saw. The psychological impact of your first real battle would be as devastating as any physical wound. The sight of men you'd shared meals with lying dead in pools of their own blood would haunt your dreams for years to come. The knowledge that you had killed other human beings, men who might have had families, hopes, and dreams just like your own would eat at whatever remained of your conscience like acid on metal. Some men would break under the strain of combat, their minds snapping like overstressed rope. They might freeze in place, unable to move or fight, making them easy targets for enemy weapons. Others might go berserk, attacking friend and foe alike in a frenzy of violence that would only end when they were killed or knocked unconscious. The thin line between courage and madness would become terrifyingly clear as you watched strong men reduced to gibbering wrecks by the horror of battle. The tide of combat would ebb and flow like the ocean itself, with first one side and then the other gaining the advantage. A single well-placed pistol shot could kill a ship's captain and demoralize his entire crew, while the arrival of unexpected reinforcements could turn certain defeat into glorious victory. You'd learn to read the signs of a battle's progress, the sound of fighting, the movement of men, the cries of victory or despair that would tell you whether your side was winning or losing. The moment when resistance finally collapsed would be almost anticlimactic after the fury of combat. The surviving enemies would throw down their weapons and beg for mercy, their faces pale with shock and defeat. Some pirates would honor the surrender, while others would continue killing in the grip of battle madness. The line between victory and massacre was often determined by the whims of individual fighters rather than any coherent strategy or moral code. The aftermath of battle would reveal the true cost of your violent profession. The deck would be littered with bodies, both friend and foe, their blood mixing in the scuppers that drained the ship's waste into the sea. The wounded would moan and cry for help, while the survivors would stand in shocked silence, trying to process what they had just experienced. The ship itself would bear the scars of combat, splintered railings, torn sails, and cannon holes that would need immediate repair to prevent sinking. Your own reaction to surviving your first real battle would be complex and contradictory. Relief at being alive would mix with horror at what you had witnessed and participated in. Pride in your courage would war with revulsion at your own capacity for violence. The adrenaline that had carried you through the fighting would fade, leaving you shaking and nauseous as the full impact of the experience hit home. You'd realize that you had crossed another line, that the person who had entered battle was not the same as the one who had survived it. The taste of battle would linger in your mouth long after the fighting was over. The metallic tang of blood, the bitter residue of gunpowder, and the sour flavor of fear and adrenaline. It was a taste you'd never forget, and one that would return to haunt you in quiet moments for the rest of your life. You had tasted violence and found that you could not only survive it, but excel at it, a discovery that would change you in ways you couldn't yet understand. Victory in battle brought its own unique form of hell, as the crew descended upon their conquered prize like vultures on a corpse. The systematic looting that followed every successful attack revealed the true nature of pirate character. Not the noble thieves of legend, but desperate men driven by greed, cruelty, and the knowledge that their next meal might depend on what they could steal from their victims. The first priority was always securing the captured vessel and its crew. The surviving defenders would be herded together under guard, their weapons confiscated, and their hands bound to prevent any attempt at resistance or sabotage. The pirates would move through the ship methodically, searching every cabin, every storage compartment, every possible hiding place where valuables might be concealed. Nothing was too small or insignificant to escape their attention. Buttons, buckles, and personal trinkets would all be stripped from the prisoners and added to the growing pile of plunder. The ship's cargo hold would be ransacked with the thoroughness of professional thieves. Barrels would be broken open, crates would be smashed apart, and bales of goods would be torn open to reveal their contents. The pirates would sort through everything with practiced eyes, separating the valuable from the worthless with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Sugar, tobacco, silk, spices, and precious metals would be carefully inventoried, while less valuable items might be discarded or destroyed in the frenzy of looting. The treatment of prisoners during the looting process revealed the depths of pirate cruelty. Captured officers and passengers would be tortured to reveal the location of hidden valuables, their screams echoing through the ship as pirates applied hot irons, knives, and other instruments of persuasion to extract information. Women passengers faced particular horrors as pirates saw them as both sources of ransom money and objects for their own twisted pleasure. The code of honor that supposedly governed pirate behavior was quickly forgotten when there was profit to be made from human suffering. The division of plunder was supposed to follow the democratic principles outlined in the ship's articles. But in practice it was often a source of violent conflict among the crew. The most valuable items would be claimed by the captain and his officers, while the common sailors would fight over the scraps. Arguments would break out over the fair value of different goods, with men threatening each other with knives over a handful of silver coins or a bolt of fine cloth. The quartermaster would try to maintain order, but his authority was often challenged by crew members who felt they were being cheated of their fair share. The search for hidden treasure would consume hours or even days as pirates tore apart the captured ship, looking for secret compartments and concealed valuables. They would rip up deck planking, tear down bulkheads, and even torture crew members to learn the location of the ship's strongbox or the captain's private hoard. The systematic destruction of the vessel was both practical and psychological. It served to uncover hidden wealth while also demonstrating the pirates' complete dominance over their victims. Personal belongings of the captured crew and passengers would be distributed among the pirates like party favors. Clothing, jewelry, weapons, and personal effects would be claimed by whoever could grab them first, leading to fights and arguments over particularly desirable items. A fine coat or a well-made sword might be worth more than its monetary value to a pirate who had been wearing rags and fighting with a rusty cutlass. The psychological impact on the victims of seeing their most precious possessions divided among their captors was often as devastating as any physical torture. The fate of the captured ship itself would depend on its condition and usefulness to the pirates. A fast, well-armed vessel might be added to the pirate fleet, while a slow or damaged ship might be stripped of everything valuable and then burned or scuttled. The decision would be made by the crew as a whole, with arguments about the ship's potential value, often leading to heated debates and sometimes violence. A ship that one pirate saw as a valuable prize might be viewed by another as a worthless hulk, not worth the effort of maintaining. The treatment of captured crew members varied depending on their skills and the pirates' current needs. Experienced sailors, carpenters, surgeons, and navigators might be pressed into service with the pirate crew, whether they wanted to join or not. Those who refused to cooperate might be tortured, marooned, or simply thrown overboard. The lucky ones would be set free in a small boat with minimal supplies, left to find their own way to safety or die trying. The unlucky ones would become victims of pirate sadism, tortured and killed for sport or as examples to others. The psychological impact of successful piracy on the crew was complex and often destructive. The rush of victory and the acquisition of wealth would create a temporary euphoria that masked the underlying brutality of what they had just accomplished. Men would celebrate their success with drinking, gambling, and violence, using alcohol and aggression to suppress any feelings of guilt or remorse about their actions. The knowledge that they had just destroyed other people's lives for their own profit would eat at whatever remained of their humanity. The immediate aftermath of a successful raid would often see an explosion of violence within the pirate crew itself. The stress of battle combined with the excitement of victory and the influence of captured alcohol would lead to fights, duels, and sometimes murders among the pirates themselves. Old grudges would resurface, new conflicts would emerge over the division of plunder, and the temporary unity forged in battle would dissolve into factional violence that could tear the crew apart. The captured goods would need to be transported back to the pirate ship and properly stored, a process that required careful planning and execution. Valuable items would be packed in waterproof containers to protect them from salt spray and rough seas. Perishable goods would need to be consumed quickly or preserved for later use. The logistics of moving large quantities of stolen merchandise between ships and rough seas was dangerous work that claimed its own share of casualties. The disposal of evidence was another crucial aspect of successful piracy. Any documents that might identify the captured ship or its cargo would be destroyed to prevent authorities from tracking the stolen goods. The ship's log, passenger manifests, and cargo records would be thrown overboard or burned. Distinctive items that might be recognized by their original owners would be altered or destroyed. The pirates would try to eliminate any trace of their crime that might later be used against them. The celebration that followed a successful raid was often as violent and destructive as the battle itself. Pirates would drink themselves into unconsciousness, fight each other over imagined slights, and engage in acts of cruelty and debauchery that would shock even hardened criminals. The temporary wealth and the release of tension after a successful attack would lead to orgies of violence and excess that could last for days. Many pirates would wake up from these celebrations to find that they had gambled away their share of the plunder or been robbed by their own shipmates. The long-term consequences of successful piracy were often overlooked in the immediate euphoria of victory. Each successful attack made the crew more wanted by authorities, increased the bounty on their heads, and reduced the number of safe ports where they could seek refuge. The wealth they had gained would make them targets for other pirates, while their growing reputation would make it harder to find victims who wouldn't fight to the death rather than surrender. Success in piracy was often the first step toward eventual destruction. The moral corruption that accompanied successful piracy was gradual, but inexorable. Each successful attack made the next one easier to justify. Each act of cruelty made the next one seem less significant. And each victim made it easier to see other human beings as nothing more than sources of profit. The spoils of violence came with a hidden cost. The gradual erosion of whatever humanity the pirates had retained until they became the monsters that their victims saw when they looked at them with terror-filled eyes. When your ship finally limped into one of the few ports that would welcome pirates, you'd discover that these havens of the lawless were every bit as dangerous and corrupt as the ships that used them. Places like Port Royal, Nassau, and Tortuga weren't romantic pirate paradises. They were festering sores on the face of civilization, where violence, disease, and depravity flourished like tropical weeds in the Caribbean sun. Port Royal, before the earthquake of 1692 sent most of it sliding into the sea, was perhaps the most notorious of these pirate strongholds. Built on a narrow spit of land jutting into Kingston Harbor, it was a maze of taverns, brothel, and gambling dens where pirates could spend their ill-gotten gains as quickly as they had acquired them. The streets were unpaved and often ankle-deep in mud, human waste, and the detritus of a society that had abandoned all pretense of civilization. The smell of these ports would hit you long before you could see the shore. A nauseating mixture of rotting fish, human waste, stagnant water, and the sweet stench of decomposing bodies that were often left where they fell. The tropical heat would intensify every odor, creating a miasma of corruption that seemed to cling to your clothes and skin like a physical presence. Even hardened pirates, accustomed to the foul air of their ships, would sometimes retch when the wind carried the full bouquet of port life across the water. The population of these ports was a collection of the desperate, the violent, and the utterly lost. Pirates made up only a portion of the inhabitants. They were joined by escaped slaves, army deserters, debtors fleeing their creditors, criminals of every description, and the human wreckage that washed up on these shores like driftwood after a storm. Women were scarce and often treated as commodities to be bought, sold, or fought over. Children, when they existed at all, grew up feral and vicious, learning to steal and kill before they learned to read or write. The taverns that lined the waterfront were more like armed camps than places of hospitality. Each establishment was controlled by a different faction or gang, and entering the wrong one could mean instant death for an unwary pirate. The ale and rum served in these places was often watered down or adulterated with substances that could blind or poison the unwary drinker. Fights would break out over imagined slights, unpaid debts, or simple drunken aggression, and the floors would be stained with blood that was never properly cleaned. Gambling was the primary entertainment in these ports. But the games were rigged, and the stakes were often life and death. Pirates would lose their shares of plunder in a single night of cards or dice, then turn to violence to reclaim what they had lost. Cheating was common and expected, but getting caught meant facing the fury of armed men who had nothing left to lose. The gambling dens were littered with the bodies of those who had pushed their luck too far or trusted the wrong people. The brothel were perhaps the most degraded establishments in ports that specialized in degradation. The women who worked in them were often slaves, prisoners, or simply desperate souls who had no other means of survival. Disease was rampant. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted infections spread through the population like wildfire. Many pirates would emerge from these establishments, not only poorer, but infected with diseases that would slowly kill them over the following months or years. Medical care in these ports was primitive and often more dangerous than the injuries or diseases it was supposed to treat. The few doctors were usually drunks, charlatans, or butchers who had been driven out of civilized society for their incompetence or cruelty. Surgery was performed without anesthesia in filthy conditions, and the mortality rate was so high that many pirates preferred to treat their own wounds rather than submit to professional medical attention. The legal system in pirate ports was based on violence and personal vengeance rather than any coherent code of justice. Disputes were settled through duels, brawls, or simple assassination. The strongest and most ruthless individuals would emerge as informal leaders, but their authority was always temporary and subject to challenge by anyone brave or foolish enough to try. Murder was so common that bodies would be left in the streets for days before anyone bothered to dispose of them. The economy of these ports was based entirely on the proceeds of piracy and other criminal activities. Merchants who dealt with pirates were often as corrupt and violent as their customers, selling overpriced goods and services to men who had no choice but to pay whatever was demanded. The prices for everything from food to weapons were inflated far beyond their actual value as merchants took advantage of pirates' temporary wealth and desperate needs. The religious life of these ports was either non-existent or thoroughly corrupted. The few churches that existed were often used as meeting places for criminal conspiracies or as refugees for those fleeing immediate violence. The clergy, when they could be found at all, were usually as corrupt as their parishioners, more interested in profit than salvation. Many pirates had abandoned any pretense of religious belief, seeing their circumstances as proof that either God didn't exist or had abandoned them to their fate. The social hierarchy in pirate ports was fluid and violent based on current wealth, fighting ability, and the loyalty of armed followers. A successful pirate captain might be treated like royalty one day and murdered in an alley the next if his luck turned bad. Reputation was everything, but it could be lost as quickly as it was gained. The only constant was change, as fortunes rose and fell with the tides and the success or failure of pirate expeditions. The temporary nature of pirate wealth was nowhere more evident than in these ports. Men who had risked their lives to capture valuable prizes would squander their shares in a matter of days or weeks, spending money on alcohol, gambling, and women with the reckless abandon of those who knew they might not live to see another payday. The philosophy of a short life and a merry one was lived out to its logical conclusion in the taverns and brothel of these lawless havens. The constant threat of attack by naval forces or rival pirate groups kept these ports in a state of perpetual tension. Lookouts would be posted to watch for approaching ships, and the entire population would be ready to flee or fight at a moment's notice. The fortifications that protected these ports were often crude but effective, manned by desperate men who knew that capture meant death. The knowledge that their sanctuary could be destroyed at any time added another layer of desperation to an already volatile situation. The cultural life of pirate ports was crude and violent, reflecting the nature of their inhabitants. Entertainment consisted mainly of drinking, gambling, fighting and sexual exploitation. Music, when it existed, was usually body songs celebrating violence and debauchery. Art was limited to crude graffiti and the occasional tattoo. Literature was non-existent among a population that was largely illiterate and had no interest in intellectual pursuits. The environmental conditions in these ports were appalling even by the standards of the time. Sanitation was non-existent, with human waste and garbage simply thrown into the streets or the harbor. Disease-carrying insects thrived in the tropical climate, spreading malaria, yellow fever, and other deadly illnesses through the population. The water supply was often contaminated, forcing inhabitants to rely on alcohol for hydration, which only added to the general level of violence and disorder. The children who grew up in these ports, when they survived at all, were shaped by the violence and corruption that surrounded them. They learned to steal, fight, and kill as naturally as other children learned to read and write. Many would follow their parents into piracy or other criminal activities, perpetuating the cycle of violence and degradation that defined these communities. The few who managed to escape often carried the psychological scars of their upbringing for the rest of their lives. The ports of the damned were both refuge and trap for the pirates who used them. They offered temporary safety from naval pursuit and a place to spend their stolen wealth. But they also consumed that wealth with frightening speed and exposed pirates to new dangers from their own kind. Many pirates would arrive at these ports wealthy and confident, only to leave broke, diseased, and broken in spirit. The ports that promised freedom and pleasure delivered only corruption and despair, adding another layer of misery to lives that were already filled with suffering and violence. The money that flowed through pirate hands like water through a sieve was both the motivation for their crimes and the instrument of their destruction. The wealth that pirates risked their lives to acquire was spent with a reckless abandon that reflected their knowledge that death was always just one battle away. The economic reality of pirate life was a boom and bust cycle that left most pirates poorer than the honest sailors they had once been. A successful raid might net each crew member more money than a legitimate sailor could earn in several years. But this windfall would typically be squandered within days or weeks of reaching port. Pirates had no concept of saving or investment. Their philosophy was to spend everything immediately because tomorrow they might be dead, captured, or simply unlucky enough to find themselves on the losing side of a battle. This attitude created a feast or famine existence that was as psychologically damaging as it was financially ruinous. The division of plunder among the crew was supposed to follow the democratic principles outlined in the ship's articles. But in practice it was often a source of violent conflict. The captain might receive 2 or 3 shares, the quartermaster and other officers 1.5 shares, and the common sailors 1 share each. But disputes would arise over the valuation of different goods, the definition of what constituted a fair share, and the handling of particularly valuable items like jewelry or precious metals. The actual process of dividing captured wealth was often chaotic and violent. Goods would be spread out on the deck or beach, and crew members would argue over every item. Fights would break out over who had the right to claim particular pieces. And men would sometimes kill each other over relatively small amounts of money. The quartermaster would try to maintain order, but his authority was often challenged by crew members who felt they were being cheated. The types of wealth that pirates acquired varied greatly depending on their targets and luck. Spanish treasure ships might yield silver coins, gold bars, and precious gems, while merchant vessels would more commonly carry trade goods like sugar, tobacco, silk, or spices. These commodities had to be converted into cash through sales to corrupt merchants in pirate ports, a process that often resulted in the pirates receiving only a fraction of the goods' actual value. The spending patterns of pirates in port revealed their psychological state and their expectations about the future. Men who had lived with constant danger and deprivation would gorge themselves on luxury and pleasure, buying expensive clothes, fine weapons, and the services of prostitutes. They would gamble recklessly, drink to excess, and engage in displays of conspicuous consumption that quickly depleted their resources. The gambling that consumed so much pirate wealth was often rigged against them by professional cheats and corrupt tavern owners. Card games, dice, and other forms of betting were designed to separate pirates from their money as quickly as possible. Many pirates were illiterate and innumerate, making them easy targets for sophisticated scams and mathematical tricks that they couldn't understand or detect. The cost of maintaining a pirate lifestyle was enormous and often underestimated by those who chose this path. Ships required constant maintenance and repair. Weapons needed to be replaced or upgraded, and supplies had to be purchased at inflated prices from corrupt merchants. The crew had to be fed and provided with basic necessities, and the ship's officers expected to live in a style befitting their rank. These expenses consumed a large portion of any captured wealth before it could be distributed to the crew. The economic relationship between pirates and the ports that served them was exploitative on both sides. Merchants would charge exorbitant prices for goods and services, knowing that pirates had few alternatives and were often desperate for supplies. Pirates in turn would sometimes rob the very merchants they had just done business with, seeing them as legitimate targets for further plunder. This created a cycle of mutual exploitation and mistrust that made long-term economic relationships impossible. The conversion of stolen goods into usable currency was a complex and dangerous process that often resulted in significant losses for the pirates. Corrupt merchants would undervalue captured goods, claiming that they were damaged, of poor quality, or difficult to sell. Pirates, eager to convert their plunder into cash, would often accept these lowball offers rather than risk holding on to goods that might be recognized by their original owners or confiscated by authorities. The lack of banking or financial services in pirate ports meant that wealth had to be carried in physical form, making it vulnerable to theft, loss, or damage. Pirates would bury their treasure on remote islands, hide it in secret compartments aboard their ships, or simply carry it with them at all times. All of these methods were risky, and many pirates lost their life savings to thieves, accidents, or simple forgetfulness about where they had hidden their wealth. The psychological impact of sudden wealth followed by rapid poverty was devastating for many pirates. Men who had risked their lives to acquire a fortune would find themselves broke and desperate within weeks of their greatest success. This cycle of boom and bust created a gambling mentality that made pirates even more reckless in their spending and more desperate in their pursuit of new targets. The economic inequality within pirate crews was a source of constant tension and conflict. While the articles might specify equal shares for common sailors, the reality was that officers, specialists, and those with personal relationships to the captain often received preferential treatment. This inequality bred resentment and could lead to mutinies or the formation of rival factions within the crew. The long-term financial prospects for pirates were universally grim. Unlike legitimate sailors who might eventually retire with some savings or a pension, pirates faced a future of poverty, disability, or death. The physical demands of pirate life meant that few men could continue in the profession past their 30s. And those who survived often found themselves crippled by injuries or diseases that made other forms of work impossible. The economic impact of piracy on legitimate trade was significant and led to increased security measures that made pirate attacks more difficult and dangerous. Merchant ships began traveling in convoys, hiring armed guards, and taking other precautions that reduced the pirates' chances of success. These defensive measures increase the costs and risks of piracy while reducing the potential rewards. The relationship between pirates and the broader economy was parasitic rather than productive. Pirates created no wealth of their own, but simply redistributed existing wealth through violence and theft. This redistribution was inefficient and destructive, as much of the stolen wealth was wasted on consumption rather than invested in productive activities. The economic drain caused by piracy was one of the factors that eventually led to its suppression by naval forces and colonial authorities. The financial records kept by pirate crews, when they existed at all, were crude and often inaccurate. Most pirates were illiterate and had no understanding of accounting or financial management. This lack of record-keeping made it difficult to track expenses, plan for the future, or resolve disputes over the distribution of wealth. The absence of financial discipline contributed to the rapid dissipation of pirate fortunes and the perpetual poverty that characterized most pirate careers. The wages of sin, as promised by religious authorities, were indeed death. But before that final reckoning came poverty, disease, and the gradual erosion of whatever humanity the pirates had retained. The wealth they had killed for would slip through their fingers like sand, leaving them with nothing but memories of violence and the knowledge that they had traded their souls for temporary pleasures that had already faded into regret. As your reputation as a pirate grew, so did the determination of civilized nations to see you captured, tried, and executed. The romantic notion of pirates as free spirits sailing beyond the reach of law and order was a dangerous delusion. In reality, you were a hunted animal with a price on your head, constantly looking over your shoulder for the naval forces that were closing in with methodical precision. The transformation of piracy from a tolerated nuisance to a priority target for elimination began in the early 18th century as European powers realized that the economic damage caused by pirate attacks was becoming unsustainable. The War of Spanish Succession had ended, leaving thousands of experienced naval officers and sailors unemployed and available for anti-piracy operations. Colonial governors were given broad powers to hunt down pirates, and substantial rewards were offered for their capture or death. Size: the naval forces arrayed against you were professional, well-equipped, and utterly ruthless in their pursuit of pirates. Royal Navy frigos and sloops of war were faster, and more heavily armed than most pirate vessels, manned by disciplined crews who had been trained specifically for combat against pirates. These ships carried experienced officers who understood pirate tactics and were prepared to counter them with superior firepower and seamanship. The intelligence network that supported anti-piracy operations was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. Colonial authorities maintained networks of informants in pirate ports, offering rewards for information about pirate movements and plans. Captured pirates were tortured to reveal the locations of their bases and the identities of their accomplices. Merchants who had been robbed provided detailed descriptions of pirate ships and crews, creating a database of information that naval commanders could use to track their quarry. The legal framework for prosecuting pirates was streamlined to ensure swift justice and maximum deterrent effect. Special admiralty courts were established in colonial ports with judges who had broad powers to try and sentence pirates without the lengthy procedures that might allow them to escape or be rescued by their comrades. The death penalty was mandatory for piracy, and executions were carried out quickly and publicly to serve as warnings to others who might be tempted to follow the same path. The psychological warfare waged against pirates was as important as the physical pursuit. Captured pirates were often tortured to extract information, then executed in the most public and gruesome manner possible. Their bodies would be displayed in iron cages called gibbets, left to rot as warnings to other potential pirates. The message was clear: this was the fate that awaited all who chose the pirate's life. The economic pressure applied to pirate operations was systematic and effective. Legitimate merchants were encouraged to arm their ships and travel in convoys, making them harder targets for pirate attacks. Ports that had previously welcomed pirates were blockaded or occupied by naval forces. cutting off the pirates' sources of supply and safe harbor. The corrupt merchants who had profited from dealing with pirates were arrested and prosecuted, disrupting the economic networks that had sustained pirate operations. Your daily life as a hunted pirate was dominated by paranoia and fear. Every sail on the horizon might be a naval vessel. Every port might be a trap. Every new crew member might be a spy or informant. Sleep became fitful and interrupted as you listened constantly for the sounds that might indicate an approaching enemy. The stress of constant vigilance took its toll on your physical and mental health, aging you prematurely and eroding whatever stability you had managed to maintain. The tactics used by naval forces to hunt pirates were adapted from military operations against conventional enemies, but modified to account for the pirates' superior knowledge of local waters and their willingness to use desperate measures to escape capture. Naval commanders would use multiple ships to surround suspected pirate vessels, cutting off all avenues of escape. They would also employ local pilots who knew the treacherous waters where pirates often sought refuge. The technology gap between naval forces and pirates was significant and growing. Royal Navy ships were equipped with the latest navigational instruments, superior cannons, and better trained crews. Pirates operating on limited budgets and unable to access legitimate suppliers were forced to make do with captured or improvised equipment that was often inferior to what their pursuers possessed. The international cooperation in anti-piracy efforts was unprecedented for its time. European powers that were normally at war with each other would cooperate in hunting pirates, sharing intelligence, and coordinating operations. This cooperation made it impossible for pirates to play different nations against each other or to find safe haven by switching allegiances. The infiltration of pirate crews by naval agents was a constant threat that added another layer of paranoia to an already stressful existence. These agents would join pirate crews as ordinary sailors, gathering intelligence about their operations and sometimes sabotaging their ships or weapons at crucial moments. The discovery of a spy within the crew would lead to brutal torture and execution. But the damage would already be done. The gradual elimination of pirate safe havens was perhaps the most effective strategy employed by anti-piracy forces. One by one, the ports that had welcomed pirates were occupied, blockaded, or simply destroyed. Nassau, the most famous pirate stronghold, was occupied by a royal governor with a strong naval force. Tortuga was abandoned as French authorities cracked down on pirate activities. Port Royal had already been largely destroyed by an earthquake and the survivors were driven out by British forces. The offer of pardons to pirates who surrendered was a clever psychological tactic that divided pirate crews and encouraged defections. These pardons were genuine, but came with conditions. The pardoned pirates had to provide information about their former comrades and sometimes actively participate in hunting them down. The knowledge that former shipmates might be working with the authorities added another layer of mistrust and paranoia to pirate crews. The capture of prominent pirate leaders had a devastating effect on the morale and organization of pirate crews. When famous captains like Blackbeard, Black Bart Roberts, or Calico Jack were killed or captured, their crews often dissolved or were easily defeated by naval forces. The cult of personality that surrounded successful pirate captains meant that their loss could not be easily replaced. The trials and executions of captured pirates were carefully orchestrated public spectacles designed to demonstrate the power of legitimate authority and the futility of resistance. These events were widely publicized with detailed accounts published in newspapers and pamphlets that circulated throughout the maritime world. The message was reinforced by the display of executed pirates' bodies in prominent locations where they could be seen by sailors and potential pirates. The families and associates of pirates were also targeted by authorities, creating additional pressure on those who might be tempted to join pirate crews. Wives and children of known pirates were often arrested and interrogated, their property confiscated and their reputations destroyed. This expansion of punishment beyond the pirates themselves made the cost of piracy even higher and more personal. The endgame for most pirates was predictable and grim. Those who weren't killed in battle would eventually be captured, tried, and executed. A few might escape to remote locations and live out their days in poverty and obscurity. But the vast majority would meet violent ends either at the hands of their enemies or their own comrades. The life of a hunted pirate was nasty, brutish, and short, with no possibility of a peaceful retirement or a happy ending. The psychological impact of being constantly hunted was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the pirate's fate. The knowledge that powerful forces were systematically working to destroy you, that former friends might betray you for a reward, and that capture meant certain death created a level of stress that few human beings could endure for long. Many pirates cracked under this pressure, becoming paranoid, violent, or simply giving up and waiting for the inevitable end to come. The human body wasn't designed to endure the conditions aboard a pirate ship. And the toll that this lifestyle took on your physical health was both immediate and cumulative. Disease was your constant companion, more deadly than any enemy's sword, and more persistent than any naval pursuit. The combination of poor nutrition, unsanitary conditions, and constant stress created a perfect breeding ground for every form of illness known to the 18th century.